Do you know the best astrophotography joke? This is a regular screwdriver, costs 50 cents. This is an astrophotography screwdriver, costs $50. And while you're still laughing, I unfortunately have to tell you that this is not a joke. The topic of today is filters, and that's a very good example. Because when you think about photography and filter, you think, for example, about your polarized filter, which you have for your DSLR. And you actually took the more expensive one, and you paid $30 for it instead of $20. So you're really proud of it. Now may I introduce to you, this is a Antlia ALPT. It's a dual narrowband filter, and it costs $400. And it's by far not the most expensive filter that you can buy. Welcome to your new hobby. So today I will introduce you in this wonderland of filters. What types they are, what you have to pay attention when you're buying one, and much, much more, right after the trailer. So, filters. Given it's only video 5 and we already talk about filters, they must be pretty important. So why do we need filters? In principle, what filters are is they filter the light and only let a certain spectrum pass. And the easiest example is what we have discussed already last time about the camera. If you're shooting mono, you have by design to filter only the red light, the blue light, and the green light to get a color picture. But that is, unfortunately or fortunately, only the tip of the iceberg. Because there is one big issue that most of us have when we're doing astrophotography, and that's light pollution. Light pollution means that all the lights of your city, the street light, the lights in the apartments, the lights of the cars, and they all are reflected up in the atmosphere and build a dome. And that is why most likely when you look up, even if it's a clear sky, you might not or only very faint see the Milky Way. And if you ever go to a very dark site, be it in a national park, on a mountain, suddenly you're in awe of all the stars and the Milky Way and everything that you can see with your naked eye. So why is this such an issue when we're making photos? Remember that I said we're making exposures of 3 minutes, of 5 minutes, of 10 minutes. In this time, all this light from the light pollution adds up. And it might be stronger than the emissions of a nebula, for example, that we want to catch. So we have to keep all this light pollution out and only let the light pass that we want to gather. And while in the early days this was quite easy, as all the street lights were actually these yellow sodium lights, today we have LED. And LED lights have a much broader spectrum, which is very close to daylight and very close to starlight. So it makes it even more difficult to filter it out. So to deal with that, we have very different type of filters, and we will look at this in a moment. But before we start, simply the practical part. Where do the filters go? Now the most cost-effective way is you simply screw the filters into your light path, which means somewhere between the camera and the telescope you screw them in. And you could do that, that's possible. As stated, big advantage, doesn't cost you anything. The big drawback, most likely you will not have only one filter. Or if you have only one filter, sometimes you will shoot with a filter, sometimes you will shoot without. Which means every time you have to screw this filter in and out, there is a danger that you let it fall, there's a danger that you come with your finger on it, that it gathers more dust. So given the pricing of these filters, probably not a good way. The second possibility that we have is this here. This is a filter drawer. So you actually screw this here in your light path, and then you have these little drawers with filters screwed into it, and you can have more than one drawer. And so then you simply have to slide it in and tighten the screw, and your filter is safe. And when you want to change the filter, loosen the screw out, other filter in, and done. Such a filter drawer system might cost you around $100. The advantage here, definitely, you weigh faster, you weigh safer than with screwing it in. Disadvantage, still a manual process, still the chance that you let anything fall, still the chance that it gathers dust, and so on. So the optimal way how to deal with filters is a filter wheel. This here is a manual one for small 1.25-inch filters. So I have to move it here around from filter to filter. And then always one filter is slided between the camera and the light path, and I can change it. The advantage here is that your filters are very well protected, that it's very convenient to change them. And then obviously the best solution is having such a filter wheel in an automated fashion, which you can steer from your computer when you automate everything. And that's ultimately what you will need when you take this hobby seriously. The filter wheels from Sevo, so if you buy a Sevo camera, makes sense also have the filter wheels from Sevo, which fit nicely and can be nicely attached to the camera. I think I stated it already with the cameras. If you need a very high amount of filters, Moravian, for example, offers a 10-slot filter wheel, which is quite unique. And with that, let's talk about the different filter types. First of all, we have to differentiate between filters for OSC, one-shot color cameras, and filters for mono cameras. They serve very different purposes. Given on the one-shot color camera side, it's really about protecting from the light pollution, while on the mono side we have no other way than using filters. Secondly, we have different filter sizes, and we have framed and unframed filters. From a filter size point of view, the smallest one are the 1.25-inch filters, which are usually used for guide scopes or for planetary. Because as stated, there you have tiny sensors because you only gather a tiny object. For deep space, very common are the 2-inch framed filters. They work for about everything, full frame and any sensor smaller, but they are quite expensive given there's so much glass. So a good tip, if you only have an APS-C sensor or below, how you can save money is to buy 36mm unframed filters. This is especially the case if you go mono. You can save quite a lot by actually taking a 36mm set instead of a 2-inch set. But be aware that because they're unframed, you need to use them in a filter wheel. There's no other way. And by the way, to actually install unframed filter into a filter wheel is a little bit a special experience, needs a little bit nerves, and I will leave a video in the comments below that I did about how I accomplished that. But generally, if you're in a one-shot color sector and you need only 1 or 2 filters, usually the 2-inch framed one are what you go for and what's also available. But now it gets a little bit more complicated, because what are we actually filtering out? And so there are 2 specifications which we have to look out for. One is the wavelength and the other the bandwidth. In very simple terms, the wavelength states what part of the spectrum do I actually need? What's the part that the filter should let go through? The bandwidth is how wide is this hole that I let through? Just a very narrow one or a broader one? As a rule of thumb, the more narrow the bandwidth, the more expensive the filter. And so when we start there with the bandwidth, there's an easy rule. The more light pollution that you have in your area that you shoot, the more narrower the bandwidth must be. So the more you pay for your filters to get a good result. And that's actually a very good illustration where you can see how this relationship is. So that also means if you have a decent light pollution situation, it doesn't make any sense that you go as narrow as possible. Your pictures will not get better. They might actually get worse because some information which would be helpful will also be filtered out. So now let's go back to the wavelength. If we start on the mono side, because that's easier, We have filters for R, red, G, green, and B, blue. They don't really help with light pollution, but they simply filter the colors out. And we use them for galaxies, for star clusters, for just a star background. So in principle for everything that's not nebula. But what if we shoot nebula? Well, then it gets more difficult. Because nebula, they emit light in three very distinct wavelengths, which is hydrogen, HA, oxygen, O3, and sulfur, S2. There is a tiny little bit of other stuff. You might hear of H-beta, so another hydrogen emission. You might hear of nitrogen, but they are neglectable. But H, O, S, these are the three main emissions. So when we shoot with mono, a nebula, we have an HA filter, we have an O3 filter, and we have an S2 filter. And they are only letting through this distinct wavelength, which is this emission. And that makes them so effective. Because it's these nebula emissions which are sometimes really, really faint. And they're way fainter than the light pollution. So without these filters, you will not be able to actually shoot these nebulas, no matter how many hours you expose. So now let's go back to one-shot color. In one-shot color, we have multiple color filters already integrated. So while this is bad, as we know from a resolution point of view, it is good because we can catch more than one of these emissions at the same time. And so in one-shot color, on one side, we have typical light pollution filters. They're not really specific for nebula, but they simply block out the light pollution. A very basic one is the Optolong L Pro, that's pretty famous. In recent days, some quad band filters from Atlia, for example, also have this purpose, and we will look at that when we go shopping. On the other side, we have the dual narrowband filters. And what does that mean? Dual 2, which is HA and O3. Because HA, the hydrogen, is red and the oxygen emission, the O3, is bluish greenish. So it's very easy that a one-shot color camera can record both emissions at the same time. And so these dual narrowband filters, they filter out both of these emissions. And also here, the same applies. The more narrow the bandwidth of both of these emissions, the more expensive the filter. Names you will hear are L Extreme, L Ultimate, both from Optolong, and the Antlia ALPT that I just showed you. Now you might say, what's with S2? Now traditionally in one-shot color shooting, you did not shoot the S2. You just let it at the side and you were okay with having the HA and the O3. But in recent days, especially ASCAR with the Color Magic D1, D2 or C1, C2 filters have actually created a filter pair where one is traditional HA O3 and the other is O3 and S2. So you have to shoot with two filters and you get all the three emissions. And that brought actually the one-shot color shooting closer to mono shooting. While from a resolution point of view, the mono is still way more superior. I, by the way, focused here again mostly on deep space. If you would go into planetary, you find a lot more very exotic filters, some which only let the infrared light pass, some which only let methane emissions pass, and so on. So it's a different game again, filter-wise. Now, before we go shopping, is the bandwidth really everything we have to care about and the only thing that defines the price? And the answer is no. There are two more factors which you have to take into consideration. The first is halos. A halo is a light around the star. That might be just very discreet and a little bit, or it might get huge. And the rule of thumb is, the better the quality of the filter, the less halos you have. And then there's another thing, which Queef the Lazy Geek has extensively reported about, especially about a filter company called Optolong. But it applies to other filters too. The issue with filter production is that it is quite complicated and the outcome is not so reliable. And we call this the filter lottery. So if a company produces filters rather cheap, they cannot afford to measure each and every filter if it really is up to specs. And you can assume that this is applying to each and every filter which is rather cheap. And that means you might have a great filter which performs as you want, or you might have a horrific filter which has some great defects. In a good case, it might be so obvious that you can send it back and you get another one. In some situations, it's just somewhere in the middle where it's hard to prove that it is not in spec, so you might have to deal with it. If you do not want to participate in this filter lottery, you have to buy a filter which is more expensive. And all the premium filter brands like Antlia, like Chroma, like Astrodon, they check each and every filter. And you get even a certificate with it, which tells you what your specifications of your individual filter are. But that has a price. And as always, it's up to you how big your risk appetite is. And with that, let's go to my computer and have a look at different filters. Okay, welcome again on the Agena Astro side. I went to optical accessories and filters. So from a manufacturer side, you see there's actually a lot of manufacturers who do filters, but there's really only a few I want to highlight here. And we can group them again a little bit like before in 3 groups: the discount value filters, then the mid-range filters, and then the luxury filters. So I already selected here Optolong as our first target. Now Optolong is a little bit a miracle, given if you wouldn't look at this video, if you would simply go on forums or ask around, a lot of people would tell you to buy an Optolong filter. And they own also Optolong filters. So it's a quasi-standard. And you will hear a lot of these expressions: Optolong L Enhance, Optolong L Extreme, Optolong L Ultimate. Here you have the L Extreme and then the L Pro. Now let's go through them one by one. First of all, they're all for one-shot color. Not that Optolong wouldn't also have filters for mono, but at the moment let's look at the one-shot colors. So the L Pro was for a very long time the default filter for simply removing light pollution. So when you have a one-shot color camera, you want to photograph a galaxy, a star cluster, anything like that, then you would use an L Pro filter to remove the light pollution. It's still not a bad filter for that. I own it myself. It's not that pricey, around $200. So it's definitely a sound choice. Now the other 3 filters, which you will hear a lot, the L Enhance, the L Extreme and the L Ultimate. These 3 are for nebula mostly. These are dual narrowband filter. The L Enhance is the weakest, the L Extreme, the mid-range from a bandwidth point of view, and then the L Ultimate has the lowest bandwidth. And you also see that price-wise they get more and more expensive. Now I want to make here a very clear statement. The L Enhance and the L Extreme have a huge issue with halos. Again, we have this filter lottery thing. There will some people tell you they have one, have no issue at all, but overall there are way too many complaints about halos with these filters. And personally, I never understood why they are so popular. Probably because they're still in a decent price range, probably because just people don't know any other brands, I don't know, but I would never ever buy one of these. If you want to go with Optolong, L Ultimate has rather good reviews, and while also some people say it has halo issues, You don't hear that often. So the L Ultimate might be a solid filter, and given it has a 3 nanometer bandwidth, which is quite tight, it has a really good price with the 389. There are other filter brands which are in these price ranges. That's mostly Baader, and that's IDAS. And then a very special role here plays ASCAR, because ASCAR has these filter duos, which I already mentioned. They're called Color Magic. You get them in a narrow bandwidth, that's the D1, D2, and the duo costs $550, and you get them in a cheaper version, the C1, C2, for only $190. And ASCAR actually calls them halo free. I think that's a little bit bigger word, but you don't hear a lot of complaints about halos with these filters. And as I explained before, the good part is that you have HA, O3 and S2 when you have such a pair. If you split it in half, paying only about $270 per filter here is a very good value. If you do not have yet any dual narrowband filter, this is actually a really great offer. Especially the D1, D2 is something I can absolutely recommend. I had the D2, so the O3 S2 filter of ASCAR, and I never had any issues with it. With that, let's step up one level to the mid-range filters. And that's also where my heart really lies. On one side, again for the one-shot color, the Antlia ALPT I feel is an amazing dual narrowband filter. I used it all the time when I was actually still having my one-shot color camera, and I really liked it. I got amazing results. $360 at the moment at Agena Astro. Absolutely worth it. It's not that narrow as the Ultimate, it's 5 nanometers, but it performs very well. On the other side, I also really like, from a mono shooting point of view, the Antlia filters. And you see all these sets that they offer for mono shooting, be it here the RGB and the luminance filter. A luminance filter is in principle a filter which lets all the light in practically. But then also here the SHO, so the S2, HA and O3 filters, which they offer in different nanometer versions. Here it's a 4.5 nanometer set, which costs together $830. Here it's a very tight 2.5 nanometer set, which costs then $1,700. Why do I like Antlia? First of all, they are the sweet spot between the value and the luxury. They have very good quality control, so each filter is checked before it leaves the factory. You get a certificate with your individual measuring. They have a really good quality, very narrow bandwidth if you want. But on the other side, I really like the modesty of Antlia, because this is something you will never ever see from any other manufacturer. When you start to read here the description of any Antlia filter, it says important, please read this important note. And then it says, please note that some users might see halos around bright stars. And then, if you must ensure that there are no detectable halos in these images, you may want to consider Astrodon or Chroma narrowband filters instead. These filters, however, cost 2 or 3 times as much as the Antlia filters do. Antlia is being honest and upfront. And I think that's so amazing, because in principle, Antlia doesn't have a big problem with halos. You practically never hear people complain about halos. But they still say it can happen. They don't go like, no, our filters have no halos. It's just something else in your system. But they just admitted that they're not perfect. And they even mentioned their competition. And I think that's amazing. And with that, let's also go to this competition that you see the difference. And this is now Chroma. This is the second best filter you can buy. But you immediately see the issue here. One mono narrowband filter, here the O3, costs $780. Here we have a set of only LRGB filters. This costs Antlia about $300 or $400 together. And here we are at $1,900. So these filters, they are great, but they come at a price. If you want to have the best or the second best here, some might argue it's the best, then absolutely go for it if you have the money. You definitely do not make a mistake. These are great filters, but yeah. Now, when you want to go for the very absolute ultimate best, you will not even find that on a Gino Astro, but I found it here in Telescope Express in Germany, and these are the Astrodome filters. These are the ultimate Mercedes, or whatever you want to call it, of filters. But you also see it here, for example, a narrowband H alpha filter, 3 nanometer unmounted for 1,400 euros or dollars. It means doesn't matter. So these are extreme prices. So filling a filter wheel with Astrodome filters for mono might cost you $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. Just the filters. Probably having the right filter or paying more for a filter makes a bigger difference than paying more for a telescope. So take your time and consider which filters you want to take. Once you have decided, really read up on them in forums, look at some review videos before you buy them. So that was it already for today. I hope you could filter out what filter comes on your shopping list. And we see us next time again when we talk about computers. Yes, that's right, computers. Until then, and clear skies.